Last week, we looked at the first part of the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, the representative of the emperor. And from the beginning of that time, it is obvious that Pilate realizes that he's got a thing in front of him that it just lacks no credibility. It lacks all credibility. That's what I'm trying to say. And so he makes several efforts to get Jesus off in the latter part of chapter 18. Just take him yourselves. No. We need your help because this is a capital punishment. And they talk about Jesus being a king. Pilate asks Jesus what truth is because Jesus said, I came and I spoke the truth. People who value the truth listen to the truth. Yeah, what's truth? And then the closing section is, you have a custom. I let a prisoner go free at Passover. You could have this maggot guy here called Barabbas, or you could have Jesus. And they said, we'll take that guy. And that's how chapter 18 closes, but Pilate is not through trying to get Jesus off. It says as chapter 19 begins that Pilate handed Jesus over to his soldiers to be scourged or flogged, depending on which translation you have. And anybody who is teaching or preaching from this particular passage faces somewhat of a dilemma in this. And here's what I mean by that. The Gospels do not play on our sympathies. They do not go into detail about what it means for someone to be scourged or flogged. And so, you feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't go into detail. They didn't. The problem with that is, those earliest readers knew exactly what it meant for someone to be scourged. I'm sure they had witnessed people being scourged or flogged. We don't see much of that, and so we may not realize. But I'm sure in sermons you heard about what Roman soldiers did. They had this handle with leather cords coming out of it, and then on the end of the leather cords were tied pieces of metal or bone or stone, which was sharpened. And you say, well, how do you know so much about scourging? I raised 2 boys. So you have to know something about scourging to raise boys. And if you flogged a man lengthwise, you let those pieces of sharp whatever dig into the back, and then you pulled it back quickly, and it would rake the flesh. And if you got tired of doing it that way, you would go around sideways and hit him so that the leather hit him on the back, and the pieces of metal would go underneath to the chest and dig in, and then when you pulled it back quickly, it would rake the chest. It was such a horrific thing that many people who were being scourged lost consciousness, and not a few died, because it was just that bad. You were left with a shredded human being, sometimes with their inner parts showing through the flesh. They took so much of the muscle and the sinew away. Now, the soldiers in this particular case, finding out why Jesus was being flogged and what kinds of claims Jesus had made, decided they'd have a little fun with it. So in addition to the scourging, and I don't think Pilate ordered this, they took it upon themselves. They made a crown for him out of thorns, and then they pressed it into his head. They didn't need any glue. The thorns sticking into the flesh would hold it in place. And then they would approach him, and they would say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and then they would whack him. Just as people would say, "Hail Caesar," they said, "Hail Jesus," but then they would hit him over and over. John uses the verb that suggests continuous action. They didn't do it once or twice. They did it over and over again. And I get the impression that during the flogging, they would hit him 3 or 4 times with the cat of nine tails, as it was often called. And then they would wait a while and talk about what a wonderful thing it was to have a king in their presence. And then they would go back to scourging him again. And when they were done, they put a purple robe on him, the royal color. If you're a king, you need something royal. And they put a purple robe on him. I wanted to read a little quote here from Morse. As I said, this is just to prove, that I read. The soldiers doubtless conceived of themselves as witty guys, able to devise an ironical situation. But the real irony is that the one whom they so mock is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. They struck him, apparently with the hands. This seems to be meant to take the place of some expression of homage, such as the dutiful kiss or the bringing of a present. John's account of the mockery is briefer than those in Matthew and Luke, or Matthew and Mark rather. There we read that the soldiers hit him on the head with a reed, not one of those soft ones, one of the big hard ones, which they had previously put in his hand, apparently as a scepter. If John is referring to the same thing, the blows will not be with the hand, but with the reed. Matthew and Mark also tell us that the soldiers knelt before him and then spat on him. So, Pilate says, I want this guy scourged. And they said, well, we could add a little to the scourging by having some fun. When I read that, I'm reminded that the Creator created us to be creative. We have the ability to create such wonderful things. Wonderful things that help people, wonderful things that make life easier, wonderful things that bring people together. But unfortunately, that creative power that God has given us enables us to be creative for evil as well. Anybody ever seen any of that in our society? I don't know exactly when it started. I was talking to my wife not too long ago about some of the different kinds of traditions that we had with Halloween when I was a kid. She'd never heard of them, and I don't blame her. They're a little weird, but you know what? My folks sent me out by myself with a pillowcase, and I could stay out there for hours and bring back a load of stuff, and nobody worried in the least what was in the bag. But you can't do that now. Because people have invented ways to make life horrific for children. Let's stick a razor blade in this and see what happens when they bite into it. Let's put a drug in the candies and see what damage we can do to these kids. Let's see if we can hijack one of them on his way home and make life. It is just so sad that people who are created in the image of God to be creative have found creative ways to be just as evil as people can be. I wonder when he first thought of the idea, the guy at Sandy Hook. You know what? I could get a rifle with 100 rounds in it and go in there and kill all these 6 and 7-year-olds. Wouldn't that be a great idea? Oh, and then it happens in Texas. When I read this story, I think, you know what? We're not that much different. And it's sad, but it's true. So you can imagine what Jesus must have looked like. Not only had he had his body worked over to within an inch of his life. He had received a lot of blows to the face. I can imagine blood. I can imagine swelling. I can imagine a closed eye. And Pilate brings him out before the crowd and says, "Here is the man. Behold the man." Ecce homo in Latin. Here is the man. And I think he was really, in his own way, just saying, hey, look at this guy. Look what I've done to him. Luke tells us specifically, I think I put that in your notes. If I didn't, it's in Luke 23, 16 and 22. Pilate did that to Jesus with the idea of releasing him after he had punished him. And so he takes him out before the crowd, believing that when they see how badly he's been hurt, they will have some sympathy for him and let him go. Look at this guy. Here is the man. And John, who is famous for his irony, I think is doing something here again. Look at the man. Do you remember what we studied a long time ago in John chapter 1? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Do you remember what's in verse 14? You get a gold star if you remember what's in verse 14. The Word became flesh. Listen, the Word became a man and lived for a while among us. He's still the Word, but he became a man. When Pilate says, look at this man, we have to understand that this is actually the ideal man. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is talking about Jesus, refers to him as the second Adam. There was the creation of the first man, and now there's the second man, and the results of the second man are so much better than what happened with the first man. But Pilate says, look, here is the man. And notice in verse 6, this is very important. As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, who saw him? The chief priests and the officials saw him, they began to yell, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" There's no him in the Greek. It just says, "Crucify!" And you know, when we see it on TV, and sometimes they make movies about this, you have this giant crowd that's shouting, "Crucify." Well, Mark tells us in his account that the chief priests stirred up the crowd to yell, "Crucify." But before the crowd is involved, it is the chief priests who are the ones that are screaming for blood. A reading from Burge. This is a story about collusion, about secret agreements with some fraudulent purpose, about conniving, about conspiring. This is a story about the betrayal of leadership. How Judaism's high priests abandoned all pretense of devotion to God and decided instead to conspire with the military arm of Rome. Remarkably, the leaders are willing to trade Barabbas for Jesus and Caesar for God, which we'll see in verse 16 in a second. Their pursuit of pragmatic goals makes them unable to discern the difference between a terrorist and a good shepherd, a statue of Tiberius, and the God of Abraham. All Judaism did not reject Jesus. The crowds cheering him on Palm Sunday bear testimony to his many followers. But Judaism's leadership did everything in its power to sabotage his success. When they saw him, the chief priests and the officials started to yell, "Crucify!" And that's where it all kind of turned in the wrong direction. Pilate is kind of fed up with them. You can tell. you can't help but see his irritation in all of this. And he says, oh, okay, you crucify him. Well, that's, he knows they can't do that. A, they don't have the legal right to do it, and B, that's not how they kill people. They stone people. They don't crucify people. And it's at that point that the Jewish leaders bring out the real charge against Jesus. It was his claim to be the Son of God. Luke tells us when they first brought him, they said, well, he's against taxes and, all that kind of stuff. But now they're in a pinch. He claimed to be the Son of God. And if you could see the movie of this, I think you'd see Pilate's face change. You claim what? Because, Larry, this is for you. Because, Larry, yeah, that's right, I'm talking to you. This is for you. Matthew tells us that previous to this, Pilate's wife, Mrs. Pilate, had sent him a note. Don't mess with this guy. I had a dream about him last night, and I haven't been able to shake it all day long. Don't have anything to do with this guy. Now, I don't know what Mrs. Pilate's experience was. I don't know exactly what the dream was like. I don't know why it's haunting her throughout the day unless she continues to recall it. I will tell you this is in the form of a confession, that most of my life I've looked upon that as kind of coincidental. It was the anchovies on the pizza, She's a Roman, she's Italian. So maybe that's what caused her to have, and then it has occurred to me over time that sometimes dreams play a pretty important part in history. You remember Pharaoh had dreams. It was a weird thing. These birds came and, what does that mean? Well, nobody can tell me. Well, Joseph says I can tell you. So there was a dream that he had that had a component of reality in his life. And then I'm reminded that Jacob had a dream of angels ascending and descending. And do you remember Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and Daniel told him what that dream meant? So people in the Bible have had dreams that have been consequential in their real life. So Pilate hears from his wife that she's had this kind of consequential dream, and I think that was upsetting to him, but not particularly upsetting until the Jews said, this man says he's the Son of God. And I can just see Pilate going, oh boy. And he brings him back in. Now you should know that both in Roman and Greek culture, it was understood that sometimes the gods walked among them in human disguise, watching for what they were doing. And sometimes they would have children who were gods living on earth. And I think it crosses Pilate's mind, what if he's one of them? Look, I've already beat the crud out of him already, and now I find out that he claims to be a son of God. I thought of this today, Paul. This occurred to me today. In Acts 14, I know you probably thought of this. In Acts 14, when Paul and Barnabas were on one of their missionary journeys and made a stop, and they healed a crippled guy. And they said, the gods have come down to us. And they called Barnabas Zeus, and they called Paul Hermes. They couldn't believe that somebody could do that unless they were the gods who have come down, because that was part of their belief system, that the gods could actually come down and be with them. And I think it occurs to Pilate at that point that maybe, just maybe, he is a god. So he says to Jesus, where are you from? Where do you come from? And I know he's not talking geography. The reason I know that is because he has already found out that Jesus was from Galilee. Do you remember what he did as a result of that? He sent him over to Herod. I'm getting rid of this guy, and I have reason to, because he's from Galilee. I don't have jurisdiction in Galilee, but Herod was disappointed and sent him on back. So when he asks him, where have you come from? I think he is asking him a deeply theological question. Are you one of the gods? And where do the gods live? Are they on Mount Olympus, or, where are you from? And he's not talking about Galilee. He's talking about maybe he has some kind of godly beginnings. You remember the answer that Jesus gives to that question? None. It's interesting that he has answered some stuff, and he is going to answer again in a minute, respond at least to Pilate. But to this question, he says nothing. Like a sheep before its shearers is silent. Jesus said nothing. Pilate is frustrated again, and if I might deviate a little bit from the script, he says something like, do you know who I am? Do you know my rank? Do you know the power that I have? Do you know the influence that I have? Do you know that I can do anything to you that I want? I can crucify you. I can let you go. It's up to me. I have that power. Jesus says, well, you wouldn't have any power if it weren't given to you from above. And I don't think Pilate thinks he means from the emperor above. I'm not sure he knows what Jesus means, but I think he realizes that Jesus has a deeper meaning than simply from his superiors in the government. And then as a result, Jesus says, and this is an interesting question, therefore, or a statement, therefore, the one who handed you over to me has the greater guilt. Did you read that? Yep. The one who handed you over to me has the great. That doesn't let Pilate off the hook. Just because someone has a greater guilt doesn't mean that Pilate has no guilt. It's just a lesser guilt than the one who handed him over. And it's interesting. People through the years have discussed who that is, and some I don't know why, but they think, well, that's Judas. Well, yes, Judas. By the way, the word betrayed actually means to hand over. That's paradidomi, to give over. That's the word betrayed. The one who betrayed or handed over to you is of the greater guilt. But the thing about it is, Judas is a bad dude, but Judas didn't hand Jesus over to Pilate. He handed him over to the Jewish authorities. Caiaphas handed Jesus over to Pilate. And I think the Lord is talking specifically about Pilate and his henchmen and these officials who are screaming for his blood. He is the one who has the greater guilt. And there's probably several reasons for that, but I just want to say, Pilate was expected to be the chief theologian in all of Israel. We probably don't think of Pilate as a theologian, and he probably didn't think of himself as a theologian. A theologian is just somebody who studies about God. Well, who should know more about God than the high priest? So not only was he supposed to know the most about God, but he was supposed to be the greatest example of the kind of person that God wanted. And that's why he has the greater guilt. He has from childhood been trained in God's ways. He from childhood has dreamed, as other Jews have probably, of the Messiah showing up. here he is, and they're screaming for his blood. That's when the Jews play the trump card. No pun intended. No pun intended. That's not what I meant. I wouldn't have either if I hadn't had this help here. They say, if he claims to be a king, and you don't do something about it, you're certainly no friend to Caesar. Because his claim to kingship has to be seen in direct opposition to the almighty, all-encompassing authority and power of Caesar. And in parentheses, and we might have to tell him that, because they had done that before. You remember I told you? They had sent an entourage to Rome to rat out Pilate for some of the other ugly things he had done. And Pilate, I believe, was put on notice. I can't be getting those kinds of reports from you. And so they said, we should point out that, that you're no friend of Caesar's if you're willing to do that. There's a couple of things that I wanted to say in here, and I don't want to miss any of them. They might not be in my notes. Okay, yes. In the first part of verse 14, there's a little thing that it says it was the day of preparation of Passover week. Wait a minute. I thought Jesus just ate the Passover with his disciples. Did we not study that? Mm-hmm. Well, now it says it's the day of preparation of Passover week. Well, it's not that difficult. I hope I put this in your notes. Let me see. Where is it? Paula, I've asked you to arrange these notes where I can read them quickly, and sometimes you don't do that. In Mark 15 and verse 42, if I didn't put that in your notes, you may want to jot it down. Here's the way Mark describes it. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. You see, Friday got a name. Preparation day. Prepare for what? For the Sabbath. You can't do squat on the Sabbath, so if you're going to get stuff done, you better get it done on Friday, and therefore Friday becomes preparation day. We do that. We have Taco Tuesday. We have hump day. What's hump day, Paula? Wednesday. How did you know that? Because that's sometimes what we call it. Well, they called Friday preparation day. So it's not the preparation of the Passover. It is the preparation day, Friday, of Passover week. Does that make sense? And that's what Mark describes it as in chapter 15 and verse 42 of his gospel. So, again, from the judgment seat, Pilate presents Jesus as their king. He had before said, here is the man. Now he says, here is your king. The first thing they say, before they say crucify him, did you notice what they said? Away with him. Now what they meant was take him away and crucify him. But I couldn't help but think that, as a civilization, we are way too good to want to crucify anybody, but away with him is not, that's what we say about Jesus. Away with him out of our schools, away with him out of our government, away with him out of our homes. Oh, no, we're not bloodthirsty, but we just want him away. I couldn't have believed when I was a kid that saying the Lord's Prayer would be a problem. We did it every morning in school. Of course, it was a Canadian school, so we're just teasing. And so I couldn't help, when I read that, I thought, yeah, that's more us. We're not so much a crucify him, we're just an away with him. We don't even want to think about him. We don't want to have to make a judgment on him. Just get rid of him. Now, a couple of readings from Morris. Did I already read one from Morris? Yes, I did, but there's another one, Paul. When he says, behold your king, as in the case of behold the man, John's irony lurks behind the words. For Pilate, there was no question of kingship. It was plain to him that Jesus was not a king in any sense in which he understood the term. He was simply using the terms of the accusation in a last-ditch effort to get the Jews to drop the proceedings. But for John, the kingship was real. He wants us to see Jesus as king in the very act in which he went to death for the salvation of men. In other words, he sees in this another irony. He is the king. Even though Pilate doesn't think he looks like a king, and even though the people out there don't want him for a king, they don't want the idea of him being a king, John is wanting us to see that he is indeed a king. And so, that they scoffed at that, away with him, crucify him, and he says, should I crucify your king? And that's where things get really dicey. Because the Jewish leaders respond this way. We have no king but Caesar. Now let that sink in for just a minute. We have no king but Caesar. I mentioned to you that when Pilate first was hired for the job, that the Jews all went to Caesarea and said, there are images in our city. We can't stand to have images in our city. And he said, you'll have to get used to it. And they said, we can't get used to it. He said, then you'll all die. And they said, fine, we'll all die, but you got to get the images out of there. And Pilate said, whoa, I had no idea you took it that seriously. Isn't that amazing? That a group of people who didn't want an image in Jerusalem would now say, we have no king but Caesar. Now, I hope you know this. If you don't, I'm going to help you know it. That it was a long-held belief among the Jews that God was their only king. The guy who sat on the throne in Jerusalem was his representative and was given the title king, but everyone understood that the real king was still enthroned above, and that was God. One of my favorite things that I read in Scripture is from 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'll read it to you. I wrote it here in my notes. It says, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. Do you remember who Samuel is? He was a judge. He called the shots in the nation. But they came to him and they said, you are old. Well, excuse me. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. So now appoint a king to lead us, such as the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to this, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. It's not you, Samuel. It's me. They're tired of having me as their king. Psalm 10, verse 16. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his hand. Isaiah 33, verse 22. For the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. It is he who will save us. It was a central focus of the theology of the Jews that God was the king who reigned in heavens. And that's why it is so unbelievable that these theologians, these leaders of the Jewish community would dare to say, we have no king but Caesar. And I want to say something strong here. They think Jesus is the blasphemer? That is blasphemy. For them to recognize Caesar instead of God as their king. It shakes me when I think about it. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were some underlings who said, did he really say that? You know, he said that we have no king but Caesar? Can he say that? Well, he did. But you see, when you have a purpose, when you have something that you've got to push through, sometimes you say anything. You are following politics, right? If you have something that you want to push through, you'll say nearly anything. And that's what they did on this occasion. Well, Jesus had predicted in chapter 5 and verse 23, I don't think this is in your notes. I know some of you jot some stuff down, but I don't put everything in your notes. Jesus had predicted in chapter 5 verse 23, he who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. So he's saying, yeah, they have a very low opinion of me. It's not surprising they have a very low opinion of God, because God is the one who sent me. Now, I thought about doing something here, and I'm going to. You run across something. Have you all ever heard of the internet? It's amazing. You can punch in some stuff, and the internet will give you a bunch of stuff. And one of the things that I found this week was a sermon that a very innovative preacher preached, in which he pretended that he was Pontius Pilate. The whole sermon was from Pontius Pilate's point of view. So I'm going to read it all. It's about 35 minutes. And no. Just this excerpt. Shall I crucify? This is Pilate talking. Shall I crucify your king, I asked? We have no king but Caesar, they replied. Unreal. The ones who once would rather die than violate their holy law would rather kill the Holy One than reckon with his truth. The spiritual leaders of Israel had chosen their king, and so would I. That's what Jesus does. You think he's going to say, choose between me and the devil. But he never says that. That's easy. There's no choice to make there. What Jesus says is, choose me or your mother. Choose me or your friends. Choose me or advancing your career. Choose me or your life. Choose me as king or you as king. And that's not easy, people. That's a message from Pilate. Jesus sneaks up on you. The thing you think he's going to have you choose between, he makes it a lot harder. Pilate made so many attempts to release Jesus. Have you been keeping track? He pronounced him innocent at least 4 times. At least, maybe more. He sent him to Herod so he wouldn't have to hand him over. He had him scourged to evoke sympathy. He offered up a choice of Jesus or Barabbas. He presented him as their king. And then notice in verse 12, this is really strange. It says, at that time, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. Now listen, that's after he's done all those things. John doesn't tell us what he did, but he was still trying to release Jesus, according to verse 12. But they all failed. I have to tell you that I love the way the story ends in Luke. My favorite gospel. God told me it was okay to have a favorite gospel. Here's what he says. Their shouts prevailed. Now listen. Pilate's up there giving reasons. They're yelling. The more reasons he gives, the louder they yell. And when they don't think they're doing a good enough job, they stir up the crowd. Get everybody to yell. And finally, the yelling is so loud that their shouts prevail. That is sad. People find that if they yell loud enough, sometimes they win, even though they don't have a lick of logic in what they're yelling. Matthew 27 again tells us that Pilate did something that John doesn't tell us. And some of you like it as one of your favorite things Pilate did. You remember? He washed his hands. He called for a bowl and some water, and he washed his hands, in which he was saying, this is not my fault. Are you sure, Pilate? Listen. When Jesus wouldn't answer Pilate earlier, he said, do you not know how much power I have? And I want to say, Pilate, do you have the power to do the right thing? Do you have that power? Do you have the power to put down these bloodthirsty people and say, justice will be served today? Do you have that power? Apparently not. Because their shouts prevailed. And yet, as we know from John, through it all, God's purpose is being worked out. We stated earlier that one of the things that we learned from John in the arrest and the trial of Jesus, Paula,
is that Jesus is in charge.
Jesus is in charge. And he's in charge here. He says just enough, but he's going to be crucified. He had said, remember, no one takes my life from me, I lay it down on my own accord. I just want to talk about one more thing, and you think, oh, his classes are getting shorter. I may have to tell the neighbors. If it would help, yeah, I can do that. Now, what was that guy's name that got off?
Barabbas.
Oh, okay. I'm glad somebody remembered. There are two little words in Hebrew which are almost exactly the same in meaning. It's a lovely couple. I took them to the airport here a while back, bar and band. You remember what that means? It means son. In the King James, in Matthew chapter 16, after Peter has made the good confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus says, blessed are you. In the King James, do you know what comes next? Simon Bar-Jonah. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. What does that mean? Son of Jonah. You see, kids weren't that eager to give up their dad's identity back in those days. And so a lot of times, they were known as their name and then son of Bar-Jonah. And Ben-Hur, well, anyway, that's another deal. Simon Bar-Jonah. Okay. Let's assume son of? What is that word?
Abba.
What?
Daddy.
I'm running out of room. His name is son of a father. Well, isn't that unique? think about it, his name is Son of a Father. And it's like, well, that could be anybody. Paul, you have any idea where I'm going with this? No.
The Father sent him to do this.
Well, okay, in my mind, I have wondered, since he got released that day and Jesus got crucified, if he ever, they stood side by side, which one do you want? And they said Barabbas, what about him? Let's crucify him. I wondered if Barabbas ever walked by the cross and thought, that's where I'm supposed to be. He went there for me. Son of a Father. And I'm just saying, that seems like it would apply to everybody. And isn't that the doctrine of the gospel? That the guy who got crucified took the place of Barabbas. All of us. All of us who are sons and daughters of the Father. It's a very generic name. Simon Bar-Jonah, oh yeah, well you're the son of Jonah. And you're the son of who? Oh, a dad. Just like you and me. The son of a dad. Now, when we look at the crucifixion, which we will do next week, which is our last session together, I want us all to always have in the back of our minds that whatever is happening to Jesus, and again, I face the same dilemma. The Gospels basically just say they crucified him. They don't. But then again, everybody in the first century knew exactly what that meant and how a person suffered and how they died. And so I'm going to bring out a little of that, not a lot. But I want us to remember that just as Jesus took the place of Son of the Father, theologically speaking, he took the place of every single one of us. I hope we understand that. And that's all I've got to say about that. Look at that. 7:49, a new record.
That's okay.
It's okay. I'm forgiven. That is so nice.
Hey, Don,
Yeah.
you said that Pilate could have